role in that structure. Of course, one of the top issues during the whole debate on the tragedy of the coronavirus has been, how is that system linking science and politics functioning during this crisis? Have the distinctions between science advice and political decision-taking become blurred? Does the structure need to change? Is it working the way that it should? And those are the questions we're going to be focusing on this evening. We have three excellent speakers, but before we turn to them, just a few practical points on how to get the most from this event. Down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A function. Do click on Q&A if you have a question that you wish to put. You don't need to wait till the end of the three opening presentations. As soon as you have a thought, do put it down as a question. And also upvote, support questions that you think are particularly relevant and pertinent. And I have to say, there are pros and cons of webinars against meeting in person. One of the great advantages of the webinar is the chair can see the questions that are most strongly supported, so we can help ensure that the debate takes the direction that is of most interest to most participants. So do upvote as well. Now, to begin the discussion, we have three excellent speakers, and the first speaker is Professor Dame Angela Mclean. She is the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defence, post she's held since 2019, and provides strategic leadership on science and technology in MOD. She's also been a professor of mathematical biology in the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford since 1994. She's a Fellow of All Souls. She was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2009. And Dame Angela, thank you very much for sparing the time to join us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak briefly here today. So I'm the person on the panel who's never been a government chief scientific advisor. So I'm not in the room right at the moment when science and politics are brought together. But I have been playing a different role, particularly during the current crisis, in what I think of as a pathway that goes from politics through civil servants to independent scientific advice and then back again. So the way I think of it is there's a bunch of politicians and they have questions they need help with addressing. They get help from their civil servants, and the civil servants pose a set of questions to some academics. And I have been co-chairing something called SPI-M. So that's basically a bunch of mathematical modelers who are a subgroup giving advice into SAGE. And I co-chair that with Graham Medley and Paul Allen. The way it's been working this 5 months is that SPI-M will then hand over their science advice to SAGE. And then it's Patrick Balance and Chris Whitty, the chairs of SAGE, who actually take that advice back to ministers. And of course, it's not a lovely circle. It's a rather complicated affair. And a lot of what I've been doing has really been going backwards and forwards between academics and civil servants in order to, and really what I've been trying to do there is to elicit a really sensible set of questions. We call it a commission. So elicit a good commission and equally elicit a sensible response from the academic modelers in SPI-M. And when I first joined in this process, the commission would look like an incredibly long list of questions. I don't know if you remember, but at the stage at which lockdown was imposed, there were 10 interventions. So things like self-isolation if you're poorly, household quarantine if someone else is in your household is poorly, but also the closing of playgrounds. And the very first commission we had was, to all intents and purposes, all possible combinations of those 10 interventions. And I do remember sitting actually right in this room on a Zoom call with a bunch of people tearing their hair out. And what we sent back was a set of time series, so very, very large number of squiggly lines that basically said, well, if you do this, then that. And I rather suspect, well, I know that that also elicited equal tearing out of hair from the civil servants at the other end. If I could have the first of my slides, please. after lots and lots of talking backwards and forwards between me, really, well, me and the other co-chairs as representatives of SPI-M and our colleagues in CCS, we've got a much broader range of what I would call science advice products that we take to them. I don't want to go into all of the details of this, but this is one of the kind of things, and I've shown you a photograph of my working copy, because you can see how doodled over it is, and it's got coffee stains on it. It lives on my desk, actually it lives on my desk or in my bag, because we use it a lot to have conversations about, well, what kind of thing might you want to do? Just to give you a sense of what it is, each one of those little squares has got along the x-axis, fundamentally, how much are people venturing outside their own front door. On the y-axis is how much is this R number that we all talk about so much, the average number of secondary infections caused by one case. And the coloured ribbons represent how many children are back at school. So turquoise is half the primary schools are back, yellow is all the primary schools are back, red is all the school children are back. And then the columns going from left to right are how good is our contact tracing, and the rows are how good is our COVID security. That's basically how safe is it to be in the pub if there's somebody else there who happens to have COVID that day. What we're trying to do with these pictures is capture inside each of those little squares the things we feel sort of most secure that we do know. So we actually know a lot about how different age groups of society work with each other, and we feel reasonably secure in that we know how much, roughly how much people are venturing outside their front door. And then there are things that we don't know so well yet. We're getting better at knowing how good we are at contact tracing. We know that we're really not good at all at measuring this thing that we call COVID security. But we put it in anyway, because it's a really helpful part of the conversation to have, is to say, we wish we knew this, and at the moment we don't know how to measure it. Next slide, please. And oops, that's misplaced. So that no sign is supposed to sit over the ruler. Because one of our greater worries is that somebody's going to take one of these pictures and use it to actually sort of say, oh, well, I can let another 5% of people out today then, which of course is not at all what these are supposed to be for. We certainly don't have that much accuracy in predicting exactly how big this R value is, but we do have some understanding about how it changes with those different variables. And I would say so with really a lot of backwards and forwards it's between civil servants and scientists in my bit of the circle. I think we have made progress. We certainly feel like we are making better, more useful answers. And I know that my civil service colleagues in Cabinet Office feel that they are asking better questions. And I think it's really important to say that that's been a collaboration. That's a two-way street. It's not that one person told the other person how to do it. The other thing that's happened, sorry, and I must not forget to say, these fabulous pictures, that we call these ready reckoners, and they were invented by a mathematical biologist at Bristol called Ellen Brooks Pollock. So the other thing that's gone on, as well as all that collaboration between different sorts of people, is astonishing amounts of long hours worked. And because of that, we have been able again and again, when sent a question from politicians via civil servants, to get answers back, sometimes on very tight turnaround times. So I would argue that it has been possible to do timely, relevant, independent advice. This business of collaborating to think about how the advice should be presented has had some people feeling uneasy, and they say, oh, well, how can you collaborate with the people who are asking the question but still be independent? I don't think that's a problem. If I could have the next slide, please. Here, I think, is where I think there is some problem. So what we've got here is just two witches. One of them is saying, eye of newt, spleen of rat, and leg of toad. Look, I'm just following the science. And I think it's that word, science, that brings me to the other half of this conversation. I think I would be happier if that word were replaced with another one. I think probably a better word would be hearing the science. And that would be to reflect the ideal that science advice should be present at the beating heart of government decision making, but only one of the things that's taken into account. So finally, if I could just talk a little bit about actually what it's been like these last 5 months attending SAGE, co-chairing SPIEM. I guess nobody who's been involved in an enduring emergency in which 45,000 people have lost their lives could possibly feel wholly happy about it. But nevertheless, the experience of working with SAGE and SPIEM has been collegiate, it's been collaborative, there's been this intense sense of urgency in the work we've done. And I, for one, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. So I think it's been possible to bring relevant science advice developed at great pace right into the heart of political decision-making. I think the fact that it has been so high profile is good for science, but it is still very important as ever to preserve the independence of the people who do that work, and also to be quite clear that the science advice is just one of the considerations on the table in the room when politicians make the decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela. And it was great to start with a practical example of exactly the work that scientists have been doing during this crisis. We now turn to Professor Sir David King, the chair of the Centre for Climate Change at the University of Cambridge, also Emeritus Professor of Chemistry at the university. He was, of course, the UK government's chief scientific advisor between 2000 and 2007. And after that served as the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative on Climate Change from 2013 to 2017. I guess David is most prominent now because of his role in creating Shadow SAGE, Independent SAGE, whatever one calls it, with, of course, implications of what the other SAGE might be like. So it's great that David has joined us this evening, and over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to try to cover in 10 minutes 3 topics. The first is the rigor of science, and this is all part of keeping science apart from government. The second is bringing them together, which is the process of becoming a chief scientific advisor, and that is your key function. And the third is communication. So let me just go to the rigor of scientific discovery, divorced from political influence. This is the principle of academic freedom, of course, in our universities. So I just want to say this is the key thing. The prime quality of the scientific research in our universities is that it's free from political interference. But the prime quality of a government chief scientific advisor, who is expected to be appointed on the basis of being a world-leading scientific expert at the cutting edge of some field of research, the prime objective there is to interact with the political system. So I spent 35 years of my career establishing the credentials in scientific capability, and then went into government. And there, the function is, and Angela's described it very well, is to be a bridge between current science and the political system. The first chief scientific advisor was Lindemann, and his second in command was Solly Zuckerman during the Second World War, appointed at the request of Winston Churchill. And for example, Solly Zuckerman gave advice on the conduct of the war. It wasn't just weapons, it wasn't just radar, it was also the conduct of the war. And a key piece of advice was on advising Churchill, who had already made a decision on this issue, where his decision was in advance of the landing of the Allied forces in France, that there should be carpet bombing of cities and factories in Germany. And instead, he advised that there should be strategic bombing of railways and bridges so that troops, German troops, couldn't be switched across to the landing place where the landing occurred. This was direct advice, and there was an argument with Churchill, and in the end, the advice was taken. So I'm going to say a science advisor in government must advise on policies based on the best science, but of course, and critically, have I lost you?
We can still hear you, David, you're fine.
Yeah, it's all fine.
You can see me, I lost the image. But the politicians decide, absolutely, no disagreement with Angela whatsoever. The buck finally stops with the Prime Minister. Now, the story about the first government chief scientific advisor emerges well after the appointments that I've just described. This is when Solly Zuckerman was the Ministry of Defense chief scientific advisor, and Dennis Healy was the minister, and Healy went to Wilson and complained that this man was trying to interfere with all of his decisions. And so Wilson met with Solly Zuckerman, and he agreed to take Solly into his office as chief scientific advisor. So that was the first government chief scientific advisor. I'm just saying this because relationships can become a little bit tight sometimes. So let me just move on to the policy issues in science and technology. So first of all, I'm going to read out to you what the statement is in the current document that you go to in government to see what the function is. The government chief scientific advisor, and I'm reading, advises the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on science and technology policy issues which cut across individual government departments. That's a very clear statement in which you will see advising on policy issues is the key function. So when it comes to policy issues, I moved into government shortly after the BSE crisis in the British farming community. British cattle had BSE, and it was a terrible disaster for our farming community. And after the crisis was over, this was a report was made by the Phillips Commission, Lord Phillips leading this commission, and that report was published just in the month that I was appointed as chief scientific advisor with Tony Blair. And I read at least the first volume of this 12-volume report, and that really became my mantra throughout my period in government, what it said was very clearly that the government chief scientific advisor and other chief scientific advisors must be able to put their advice into the government ministers, into cabinet, but also into the public domain. And what the reason for the Phillips Commission report saying this was quite simple, that during this epidemic amongst the cattle, the government minister concerned, the Minister of what was then a Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, was trying to persuade the public that British beef was perfectly safe to eat, and even fed his daughter a hamburger on television. And this was at a time when it was understood that variant CJD, a new human brain disease, was probably arising from people eating British beef. And so the science advisors were kept away from the television. And what Phillips said quite simply is, when they said they were following science advice, the people couldn't understand whether or not that was true. And so he said the science advisors must be able to go into the public domain with their advice. And that was the mode in which I operated. Foot and mouth disease epidemic, when the Prime Minister at a COBRA meeting asked everyone at the meeting whether they had advice. And when it came to my turn, I was the only one who could deliver advice that I'd obtained from a group of epidemiologists and veterinary scientists drawn from outside government. And so it wasn't long before the Prime Minister asked me to effectively take over the management of that epidemic, and I set up a committee. And on the committee, of course, I had not only science advisors, but I also brought in veterinary scientists from outside government. I had the chief veterinary officer on board, and perhaps critically, I had a Ministry of Defense strategic expert who does all of the calculations for the capability of the Ministry of Defense in any war operation. And the Ministry of Defense was absolutely key to the management of the foot and mouth disease epidemic. So it was the Prime Minister, and I was meeting him once a day, who was taking decisions, but the decisions were always to back me and back the decisions of the committee all the way through that pandemic, quite simply because, as the Prime Minister wrote in his autobiography, he didn't really understand the science underlying what we were doing. And so handed over to the scientists who could manage it. Subsequently, I set up the government's foresight program in an in-depth way. We had a foresight program, it was rather superficial, and I turned it into an in-depth instrument. Each program involved at least 100 experts, the biggest programs 350 experts, and worked for 2 to 3 years to deliver an in-depth foresight analysis with scenarios built forward in time. The longest scenario went out to 2080, where we were looking at flood and coastal defense problems for the UK out to 2080, with all of the best calculations we had available on climate change and how flood risk would increase with rising sea levels over that period of time. That report, when it went into government, I put it to the cabinet. Blair asked me to talk in Parliament about it. The meeting was attended by members of both houses of Parliament. And the upshot of all of that was the British government's decision to lead the way in the global negotiations. We arrived at this 80% reduction by 2050 as our unilateral indicator of how seriously we were taking this. So I would say it was successful. But let me just quickly say, alongside that, I ran a big program on cognitive systems. And this was really looking at our capability in IT and in brain science and putting these two together. 2001 to 2003 was this program, which really in a way foresees AI. And what has emerged from that is a number of new university departments following on that work. Now, the key point I do want to make about these programs is that I brought in at least one Minister of Government to chair each program, because the final object of the game was to see that the 4 scenarios that we always predicted forward in time, one of them was very attractive and one of them was not at all attractive. So ministers had to be brought in to see that we started moving in the more attractive direction and took the right decisions to reach that. Infectious diseases was the biggest project that I ran at that time in the Foresight program. And it was that program published in Go Science in 2006 that foresaw a pandemic of the kind that is now causing such a lot of damage to the global system and to the global economics. Now, the third point and my last point is I just want to say the GCSA must be a good and clear communicator. Jargon-free, but with rigor is the critical aspect of that. And so following through from what I'm saying to you now, I set up Independent Sage because I was frankly worried that we were not told who was on the government Sage. We were not told any of their processes of decision-making, and nor did we see a free chief scientific advisor, chief medical officer available for requests to go on the media and to be challenged by the media. So when I set Sage up, Independent Sage up, we didn't know even who the people on Sage were. Now, I think what you will know is that we have continued to the present time. There has been some criticism of this, but the most important thing I do want to stress is that we are a group of experts who include a good group of healthcare specialists. We also have experts on operational health. This means that we're looking right across the board and are able to give policy advice on the basis of that. I stress again, the decision rests with the Prime Minister at all times. So it's an orchestra of specialists. I am simply the conductor of the orchestra. But I do also want to say that all members of the group are taking up frequent invitations to appear on television and radio and the press. And I must admit, none of us expected this, but of course there is a very big appetite out there for experts to talk up where we are, what the policies are, and what needs to be done. So I just leave you with that. No one else is fulfilling this role in terms of the public. And if we're going to have an advisory system that manages the trust of both the government, the cabinet, the Prime Minister, and on the other hand, the public, that is what we need.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And particularly their point about openness and public access to information, and to what extent that's a role for SAGE, which I'm sure we will wish to pick up on. Now we turn to our third speaker, Professor Sir Mark Walpert, who was, of course, until 10 days ago, the CEO of UKRI. I had the privilege of serving on the board of UKRI, and this is actually Mark's first public appearance and first opportunity to talk since he stood down from UKRI. But before he became Chief Executive of UKRI, he was, of course, also the UK government's Chief Scientific Advisor from 2013 to 2017, one of the successors to Professor King. And before that, he was a director of the Wellcome Trust. Mark has been very closely involved in the handling of the virus and also has a deep experience of how the Chief Science Advisor works. So Mark, we are delighted that you have joined us this evening, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, David. So yes, I'm David King's grandson as Chief Scientific Advisor, and of course, John Beddington was my father. So the title of this session is Science and Politics, How to Bring Them Together and How to Keep Them Apart. And I think it's quite important actually to distinguish science and politics in the sort of broad sweep of national affairs, and then the role of science in an emergency at an extraordinary pace in the case of COVID-19, and then rather more slowly, as in the case of climate change and environmental degradation. And it's sort of inevitable in a meeting on this topic today that the focus, of course, will be on science advice in an emergency, and I'll come on to that in just a moment. I think it's also important to distinguish between a more or less narrow view of science, the world of STEM on the one hand, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and I think a much more inclusive view that I prefer to call STEAM, science, which includes the social sciences, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. And that is what the Germans call Wissenschaft, and it encapsulates the broad sweep of knowledge resulting from systematic study and research, including subject areas such as human values. And looked at in that sense, science, of course, is the evidence base for politics and should be intrinsic to the political process. George Russell, who was an Irish nationalist and polymath, wrote in 1912, "The great problem before democracy is the evolution of a social order which will ensure, so far as anything human can be ensured, that the democracy will put forward its best thinkers, its wisest men of affairs, and that it will develop a respect for the women of special and expert knowledge." I changed one word in that paragraph. Every people get the kind of politicians they deserve, and we must organize the nation so that the people may be more deserving of and more discerning of better qualities in their public representatives than they are at present. So that was clearly a problem then, and it remains a problem now with no obvious solution in sight. And I was noting as the questions were coming in that someone asked how we could get more scientists into politics. And the problem there lies with the scientists, not with the politicians, because they need to stand. And in general, I think with the rise of populist politics across the world, the application of Wissenschaft is in trouble. And I will come back to George Russell again towards the end of my remarks. But now I want to turn to the whole issue of science and politics in emergencies, because this is such a salient issue in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to kick off with the most fundamental point, and that is that its government is supremely important in the leadership and policy decisions that need to be made at pace and in the context of uncertainty in a national and indeed a global emergency. And the fundamental principle that governs the relationships between science and politics is that the scientist advises, the politician decides. And in fact, I was rather sort of struck by Sir David's example of Solly Zuckerman in the war, which is, it does strike me that there's a certain sort of hubris that a person who was an extremely good anatomist at the University of Birmingham should suddenly become an expert on bombing strategy. I would have thought there were plenty of sort of generals around who would probably have quite strong views and expertise on that as well. And I think there are some dangers of people thinking that they know about everything. So when things go rapidly wrong, there needs to be a hardwired mechanism to bring science and politics together quickly. And that is one of the strengths of the UK system. And indeed, it was one of the important lessons that was learned from the handling of the foot and mouth epidemic of 2001. And I actually commend the report of Ian Anderson from July 2002 on the handling of that epidemic to tonight's audience. I think it's fair to say that not all of the lessons have been learned. But one important lesson that was learned was the creation of the Science Advice Group in Emergencies with the nice acronym SAGE, which was created by Sir John Beddington in 2009 to help to handle the swine flu pandemic. So I think we would all recognize that when things go wrong in a global emergency, there are typically cascading consequences for complex, largely urban economies around the world that in engineering terms represent immensely complicated, interconnected systems of systems. And indeed, as modern economies have become more efficient, they've become less resilient. So a shock in one part of the system reverberates widely, be it a failure in a transport system, of IT, which fortunately has held up remarkably well through the pandemic, of loss of availability of crucial products in global supply chains. And again, with the exception of personal protective equipment, ventilators, food at least has held up very well. But the issue here is that policymakers are constantly having to balance competing priorities. For example, maintaining the supplies of goods and services, whilst at the same time reducing the mobility of citizens as far as possible. And so every decision that policymakers are making essentially requires some degree of balancing, some degree of trade-off. And COVID-19 is about as challenging as it gets. I think it's by far the most challenging emergency, if you accept the Second World War, that any chief scientific advisor has faced in the last 50 years or so. And a key goal must be to prevent direct harm from infection. But of course, policies aimed at achieving this alone bring their own potential harms. For example, there are other risks to health from loss of access to health services for people with other diseases. And so protecting the health service has been a very important strategic aim. There are obviously harms to mental health of prolonged social isolation and being trapped in the home. And that's before we even get onto the broader societal effects from the loss of education that a generation is suffering, of the long-term risks to millions, billions potentially around the world, of change in work, of the long-term economic consequences. There are huge issues of intergenerational equity, and one could go on for a long time. So the policymaker, either in war or peace, essentially looks through three lenses when they're making policies. The first of those is, what do I know about X or Y? And that's the lens of evidence. And it's also the lens, of course, where there's often great uncertainty. And this is where broad science advice is essential. But the second lens, which is also important, is if I make a policy, is it deliverable? And what might be the unforeseen consequences? And then, of course, the third lens that policymakers look through is, how does this policy fit with my values, the personal values, political values, and with the values of the electorate? And ultimately, the politicians, who are the people we elect as our policymakers, integrate the inputs from these three lenses to decide on policies. And I'm afraid, in my view, too many commentators, including some expert commentators, have looked through only one lens, often an extremely narrow lens with a visibility of a tiny, tiny angle, where policymakers have to look through all the lenses. And I've always thought it's much easier to be the advisor than the decision maker. So Harold Lasky wrote a fairly coruscating letter to Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1924. And he wrote, "I can, I think, recite fairly fully on the habits of bureaucracy. The things which distinguish it are these. 1, its members all say the same thing. 2, they cannot understand that their expert knowledge is open to independent inquiry." And here he was not referring to inquiry by other experts. 3, they have complete contempt for all outside their charmed circle. And 4, they don't realize how many people there are who want to share, however small, in deciding their own destiny. They hardly see why people should want to make their own rules. So I end with a well-known aphorism, which is often attributed to Churchill, but helpfully researched more deeply in a rather wonderful website called quoteinvestigator.com. So this is where I came across George W. Russell, who wrote in 1912, "Experts ought to be on tap and not on top. The official classes will, I believe, be much happier serving the public than in setting snares or inventing schemes to control industries and movements they had no part in creating, where their interference would be fatal to any fine idealism or noble humanity." And Harold Lasky, in that letter to Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote, "They cannot understand that their expert knowledge is open to independent inquiry. If I may so phrase it, they do not see that the business of an expert is to be on tap and not on top. That is the role of science advice." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. 3 excellent opening presentations. I'd now like to invite all 3 of our panelists to turn on their videos. We are going to give priority to a question from Chi Onora MP for Newcastle on Tyne, and also, of course, Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital. Chi, over to you.
Hi.
Oh, fantastic. Yep,
Great.
we can hear.
Can I just thank the presenters for those 3 presentations, and it's a great and very relevant debate. And as someone who went from a scientific profession, engineering, electrical engineering, to politics, it is a debate that I take very personally, and I can tell you actually that the culture shock of going from science to politics is possibly the greatest that I've ever experienced. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm afraid that I have been struck by the old joke about when looking at the way ministers engage with science and use science, the old joke about drunks and lampposts, and that they use them more for support than for illumination. And what follows from that, not necessarily, is that when things go wrong, the drunks blame the lampposts. And I thought that when Therese Coffey was criticizing the science advice, that was a really bad sign of what might be to come. So I'm really pleased to see science on the front page. I'm really pleased that it's one of the few, if you like, benefits that kind of come out of this pandemic, is that a greater respect and appreciation and celebration of scientists, and scientists having greater visibility. But I wonder if the panel would agree that the only sort of effective response, and I think this is what some people said, to that kind of dilemma of being used as support rather than illumination, is greater openness and on the part of scientists. I think that's one of the things we've been talked about, but also greater trust in the people to get across the complexities of science, the scientific method, the role of doubt in science, and that requires scientists to both trust people more, but also, I would say, to represent the people that they are trying to talk to better and to have greater diversity amongst our scientists.
Thank you very much, Chi. As we have got a hard stop at 7 o'clock, so time is tight, I'm going to add to your question a second question, which I think is related, because I think that Chi is asking about openness and trust. And it's the top upvoted question from a certain Venki Ramakrishnan. And his question is this: when you have an independent sage and it comes to a different conclusion from sage, does this not create confusion in the public and a problem for government policy? How do you see this as being resolved? So let me start with you, David. Both, you've obviously made the case for openness, but there's also an argument that from Venki that this may we may be creating confusion. Do unmute, David.
I'm fully aware, of course, of this charge creating confusion. Very difficult to recognize that, because please remember what I said when we were set up. The advice from SAGE was not published. The minutes from SAGE were not published. The membership of SAGE wasn't published. So we were not creating confusion. And even today, if there was confusion, it would be because the science advisors on SAGE are not there arguing their lot with us when we're faced with the challenges of the public. And frankly, every single member, I've got 13 people on independent SAGE, they are all outstanding experts in their field, and every one of them has been subjected to the normal stuff that people in politics are used to when they're faced with the public. So I don't quite recognize the confusion that's being created. However, at every stage, what independent SAGE is doing, and this is critically important, is to say, right, this is where we are now, and this is our advice on moving forward in time. So if I may give a very specific example, we are now putting forward, we have put forward last week, our proposal that we should be heading towards zero virus in the country. And what that means is that we should be taking the steps towards minimizing the amount of virus in the public domain and doing that as quickly as possible so that we can then free up our economy and begin to rebuild it again. Now, I realize we will never be a totally free economy because other countries will still have the disease. But at the moment, there's 10 times less disease per head of population in our neighboring partners, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, but also in Ireland. So Angela, you're disagreeing with me.
No, you're not correct. I saw the numbers this afternoon. The per capita incidence is very similar. Scotland looks good because it's tiny.
No, I'm sorry. We're saying we've got to get to 1 in a million per day. And
when did the numbers? When did you last see the incidence numbers?
We publish our numbers every single week, Angela. We publish them.
I saw them this morning. Incidence incidence per capita is pretty much the same. Obviously, very hard to guess in, very hard to get it right in Ireland because you're down in your zeros and your ones. So I'm sorry.
So what I would say is that Wales is roughly half where we are, and in Scotland a 10th, and in Northern Ireland a 10th, very nearly a 10th, and in Ireland a little more than that. So the point I'm making here is simply, yes, let's have this argument and discussion, let's produce the figures, and then examine what policies are we following. I don't understand at the moment, sorry, David, just to finish the sentence, I don't understand at the moment whether we're happy to plow along as we are or whether we are trying to eliminate the virus.
Let's go straight back to Angela, because you both had an important empirical point, but also there's this wider issue. How much is it, can everything that SAGE does be public? Are there any constraints?
So it depends on which stage you're talking about. In this one, I think in the fullness of time, it should all be published. I think that's an argument that has been accepted. The membership of SAGE is public, and I agree, I think that's right. And its advice is being published as time goes by. Personally, I think it's right that the advice we've published, we hand over this week, my inclination would be to say that the politicians who must decide, I think, have a right to have that advice for a while before it goes into the public domain, actually. There are a couple of other points I would like to make. And actually, I think David has illustrated beautifully with the example he's just brought up. So the words he used were the proposal that we should be heading towards zero virus in the community. That is clearly policy advice, not science advice. And I think the right way to handle that would be to show the pros and cons of heading for zero virus in the community. That's going to be a very, very expensive strategy. Of course, it would be great if we could achieve it. But I think David's very clearly put his cards on the table that he's completely happy to give policy advice. And I would disagree. I think the job of a government chief scientist is to give science advice and let politicians decide. And then the third point I would like to make about confusion is that I think it was a mistake to use the same word. I think calling it independent SAGE was bound to cause confusion, and it's quite clear that it has caused confusion. For example, in the debate about whether or not it's safe for children to return to school. And I think there is no question there's been confusion, and using the same word, SAGE, has most certainly contributed to that confusion.
Mark, over to you on this, particularly this whole issue of what can be open and whether there is confusion.
Well, I mean, firstly, I just remind David that Ian Anderson made exactly the same comments about the lack of transparency and lack of communication in the Foot and Mouth report. And actually, a principle of SAGE has always been that members of SAGE are entitled and do speak in the public on their expertise, and they have been throughout, actually. And so I'm afraid I do think it's confusing, and I think I agree with Angela's point, and I think too much of what the so-called independent SAGE has been doing has been criticizing the implementation of policy. And it's a bit like sort of Solly Zuckerman criticizing whether the bombing was accurate or not. And so I think, and I think another thing that's very important is that science advice never works terribly well with people if it's broadcast at them through a megaphone. And so, as you know, David, from your experience, the important interaction was the day-to-day interaction that you had with policymakers. And that is, if you like, the privilege of being a permanent secretary and a chief scientist in government. And you don't actually expect the government chief scientific advisor in an emergency to be going out and saying that it's all wrong in terms of the policy implementation. I'm sure they speak about the logistics all the time. I think it has been confusing, and I think it hasn't been very helpful, to be honest.
Thank you. I would just add, I think Angela's point, that which I think was an important but subtle one, that sometimes ministers just need a little bit of time. You do find as a minister, as soon as data is out there, as soon as something, you're immediately expected to have a coherent view in response to it. And often one of the things that you need is just time to organize your thoughts in the light of this new point, this new data, so that when you are first asked a question, you can do so on the basis of some reflection and information, rather than being completely new to you as well. And I think that may have been an angle in this debate. We're getting tight for time, but I think we've got a couple of other questions I'm going to try to squeeze in. One is, and it's the next two. One is, how do you strike the right balance between a clear message or instruction and communicating the uncertainty? That's another clear difference between how scientists operate and how public communication may operate. How do you resolve that tension? And then we're focusing on ministers, but there's an angle, a question of not just ministers, but I think in several of the questions, what about politicians? What about the class of politicians? What about the level of understanding of science of politicians? How scientists communicate to them more widely? And again, if our three panelists can be brisk, we may just be able to squeeze in one more question. But David, your comments on those two.
So I feel a bit sort of vague about the answers I'm going to give you. The position that really I do want to emphasize, and in a way I'm going back to what we were saying earlier, if I may, the position I do want to emphasize, first of all, is there is no disagreement from my position compared with those who say it is the politicians who decide. Of course I agree with that. The buck stops with the Prime Minister, absolutely. But on the other hand, if you want to keep the trust of the public, it's critically important that you also explain through science advisors, if that's a critical pathway, you explain that to the public. I think the issue that really underlies this discussion here is a key misunderstanding of the role that we have been taking. We're not challenging the normal process, except insofar as I emphasize Lord Phillips' report, the Phillips Commission report, on the key importance of the Chief Scientific Advisor being able to go out there and explain to the public to meet the challenges of the media. So that really is the key answer I want to give.
Mark, your comments on that.
Well, I mean, I think there's the generic question about sort of science and politics, science and parliament, where you know, Chi has put her finger on it in a way. The challenge is that too few scientists and researchers in general tend to stand for politics, and it is the problem with democracy in a way. So I think that if people want to make policy, then they do need to become politicians ultimately. So I think there is something about encouraging more people to go into politics, although it's not necessarily the most attractive thing to do necessarily for many people. I think on the science communication, actually, you'd have to say that the quality of the communication of the science by the media has, on the whole, been absolutely outstanding, actually. You see better and better articles on the BBC, on all of the media site, I would say. I think the science journalists have bent over backwards to report accurately. And I think one of the big challenges for government in managing an epidemic like this is achieving a level of social solidarity. And it's quite difficult to get people to behave in particular ways if you don't have, you know, clear communications and clear sort of common behaviors. But I would say on the science communication, there's probably been more science communication as part of this than in any previous emergency ever, actually.
Angela, anything you want to add on that?
Well, very briefly, science for other politicians. Personally, I'm a huge admirer of post notes, those things that come from the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. I use them myself when there's some bits of science I need to get into really fast. They're fantastic. Uncertainty and science, what a fantastically good question. Seems to me, right at the moment, we are having a reasonably good debate about that when we worry about the winter. You know, it could be really quite bad and we don't know.
We've been talking about SAGE. It's fantastic. We've also got in the audience Donald Bryden, who is the chairman of SAGE, Britain's largest technology company. So we've got another SAGE as well. And he goes on to comment that his concern is with scientists sharing opinions and prejudices with the public and not peer-reviewed scientific conclusions. So the question is what role the scientist has. I think as we are so tight for time, I'm also going to ask one question that I don't quite see in the list, which is simply in terms of this question of the right public role for scientists. There are some members of the science community who think that science advisors should not have been standing alongside the Prime Minister when he was answering questions. Paradoxically, they actually think in some respects, the science advisors have taken too public a role, which meant that they in turn got associated with the policy decisions, not the science advice. So there's another strand which of argument one here is kind of the other direction from David's that scientists have been too prominent. A quick observation on that from all three of you. David, starting with you.
So very, very quickly, let me say what I've always tried to do is speak to the public. When I was Chief Scientific Advisor, I did spend a lot of time doing that and setting up public discussions on all of the issues that I was involved in. And that's exactly what Independent Sage is doing. Actually, our very first meeting that we had was in the public domain. And this week we've had another public meeting. So discussions with the public, absolutely critical. And in these public meetings, we then adjust our subsequent position, our minutes, on the basis of the questions and discussion that has taken place with the public. All of these issues of uncertainty are often related to the feelings that people have in the way that they're being treated. So I think having the ability to listen to the public voice is critically important.
Thank you. Angela, quick comment?
Well, I did a couple of those. The first one was great fun, and then they got pretty horrible, actually. I remember once asking one of the press officers in Downing Street, why do we keep doing this? And he said it was because 5 to 10 million people were switching it on every night. Now, of course, I can't tell how much of that is because there was some specialist information available. If I were asked to do it, I would do it again. And the point that Sheeta already brought up about have we been set up to take the blame? You can imagine we think about that a lot. I think, well, my personal opinion is the alternative was to walk away, and that would have been completely wrong.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, I mean, firstly, I agree with Donald. Scientists should stick to the science. I think that's really important, actually. On the point about appearing alongside politicians, well, I mean, the answer is that has happened in previous emergencies. It happened with Novichok, for example. It's happened with avian influenza in the past. And I think that actually the scientific community, including many of the scientists who are on SAGE, have been out there talking to the public extensively. And I must say, I have a lot of sympathy with Patrick and with Chris Whittier at the moment, and with Angela as well, because they are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They are communicating furiously. They do a very good job standing alongside the Prime Minister, but it is inevitable that there are some risks associated with that, I think.
Well, thank you to our three panelists. Thank you to our questioners. Really tricky issues, very openly and frankly confronted there. And we should, I think, just end by appreciating the quality of the scientific work and advice that is underway and the intensity with which a lot of people across the country are working on these issues in the science community. Thank you all very much indeed for participating, especially thanks to our three panelists. Good night. Thanks.